Yeah, so hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the second GlobeDrought webinar. I would like to make sure that everyone on board can hear me. So if you can hear me, please write yes in the text chat that you can find on the right side. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Welcome again, and welcome also to our presenters for today's webinar. So as you know, today the main topic is about drought and migration, and we had the pleasure to have Dr. Kees van der Geest from the United Nations University in Bonn, and Ms. Lisa Thalheimer from Oxford University. And we will have two presentations for the first half of the webinar, and then the second part of the webinar will be to receive your questions in the text chat or through the audio and microphone. So now I will give the microphone to Dr. Kees. Dr. Kees.
Hello. I hope everybody hears me.
Yes.
Great. Can you put my PowerPoint on the slide?
Yes, sure. And would you please activate your video so we can see you during the presentation, if you don't mind?
Oh yeah, actually, yes. Okay. I see Lisa also. Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to share a bit of research with you. So the title of a chapter I wrote a few years ago is called Environmental Change and Migration, a Review of West African Case Studies. I'm sure that during this lecture series you'll hear quite a bit about Africa. I guess drought and migration, one of the places where this relation is studied most so far has been on Africa. So I did my own PhD research on Ghana in West Africa, and I'll share some results of that later. But after doing my own research, I thought like I want to know how my own findings from my own empirical research relate to what other studies have found. So I teamed up with two. Let me see how to get to the next slide. I teamed up with two fellow researchers, Victoria van der Laan and Clemens Romankovic, and we did a meta-analysis of other studies that looked at the relation between environmental change and migration in West Africa. And we published that in this book, the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Displacement and Migration, which is a very recommendable book to read if you're interested in environmental migration. And I'm using the arrows, but yeah. So we focused on a particular region, the West African Sahel. And so what I'll briefly talk about now is the methods that those studies used and some of the key findings. So why did we choose this region? So we know for West Africa that there's a high seasonality. So there's a dry season and a wet season. And people's livelihoods and actually the whole sort of daily routine is much linked to the seasonality of rainfall. So there's in the dry season, life looks totally different from the rainy season, and there's also a lot of mobility historically attached to this seasonality. You can think, for example, of pastoralists who move with their cattle over long distances looking for green pastures for their animals. But it's also there's a long tradition of people working seasonally in other parts of West Africa. So they move over quite long distances to be able to make a living. Also, it's interesting to look at the relation between drought and migration specifically for this region, because contrary to, for example, big parts of Asia, agriculture in Africa and West Africa is mainly rain-fed agriculture. So there's very few places where irrigation is developed much. So because agriculture is rain-fed, people's livelihoods are much connected to the climate. And if there's a drought, there's a good chance of crop failure. When crops fail, you would intuitively you would think that would also result in migration flows. Maybe just quickly on the climate. I'm sure that in this lecture series you'll hear much about drought in Africa, but I think it's important to just briefly look at this graph of rainfall average for the Sahel over in the whole 20th century and the first 2 decades of this century. What we see is that in the 50s and 60s there was a really high levels of rainfall, and then a very sharp drop in rainfall in the 70s and 80s, and then what you could call partial recovery in the last 2 decades, or from the 90s. But still, if you look at the rainfall now, it's better than in the 70s and 80s, but it's much below the long-term average still. So that's something to have in mind. So I think it's also really important for all of you to realize that people do not migrate just because of the drought. There's 2 things in between. So when droughts hit, these have an impact on ecosystem services. For example, like I said earlier, the ability to grow food, which impacts people's livelihoods, and if they can't make a living, if they can't feed their family, it can result in a decision to migrate. But as you'll see later on in the presentation, the opposite can also happen. That because of not having enough money in a bad season, sometimes people actually do not migrate because they can't afford to migrate, right? So what we did for these 15 case studies that we looked at what kind of methods they had used, and we used there's an overview of methods by Piquet. I should have mentioned the reference there, H.M. Piquet from 2010 paper, who categorized all the methods that are being used to study the relation between environment and migration. Those 6 methods are commonly used. So we looked at for these 15 case studies, which methods the different case studies used. And first one, ecological interference based on area characteristics. That's mostly like spatial analysis, where you compare environmental data with population data, for example, from the census, looking at, for example, whether districts or regions or countries with lower precipitation have higher migration. So that's that one. The sample surveys, that's like questionnaires where you ask people with a fixed list of questions about their livelihood activities and their migration behavior. And then we have time series that looks at how for example, rainfall changes over time and how that relates to migration patterns over time. So we could also call it longitudinal analysis. The multi-level analysis combines like area data with more personal data, for example, from questionnaires. Then we have agent-based modeling, which actually uses both area data and individual data to project migration flows in the future under different scenarios. And then we have the qualitative and ethnographic work, which is usually about interviewing much smaller numbers of people, but in much more depth. What we see for those 15 case studies, that a lot of them use a mix of surveys and qualitative work, so that kind of ethnographic work. And the others, the other methods in this list of 6 were used much less in the West African case studies. Going to the next slide. So another thing, when you study migration, often this happens in either the place where people come from or the place where people go to. But what we actually see is that the best results in terms of research often come from studies that are able to combine fieldwork in both the source area and the destination area. And we also see that usually the best results are achieved when studies do not use just one method, but that they combine methods and they combine different levels of analysis. So it's like if you only interview people, you sometimes lack the bigger picture that you can get if you also make sure you gather relevant data from the census, from remote sensing, from satellites. So this combining different levels of analysis is really important. And what we also often see is that usually because of a lack of data, these studies lack a longitudinal perspective. So they look at the situation now, but you actually get the best results if you're able to compare the situation now with the situation in the past. What we also see is that many of the studies say like, okay, here we have a certain migration flow, and we want to find out what the role of the environment has been. And it's like it looks like by looking specifically for environmental causes, sometimes these environmental causes are overstated, right? What we also looked at what we also saw for those 15 case studies is that almost none of them looked at gender at all, which I think is a weakness. So if you look at these 15 case studies together, what are common findings? So first, almost all those studies highlight what we call multi-causality, that drought and environmental change. Actually, sorry, I forgot to say that in the title of the presentation is Environmental Change and Migration. But in West Africa, we see that most of those studies look at drought and changes in precipitation over time and rainfall variability. What we see is that yes, those can contribute to migration, but they are never the only cause. And if studies find that drought or climatic factors did play a role, usually the finding was that those were not the main driver of migration. Right now, in the studies that we looked at, which found that environmental changes do play a role in driving migration, this is usually a temporary migration. So people after a dry year spend maybe some time in a different location to make a living, and maybe to send remittances back to their family to be able to buy food. But often after some years they would, or some months or some years, they would return. At the same time, it's important to know that sometimes these temporary migrations turn into more permanent migrations. So a person would go a few times on a migration trip for a few months, and then establish the necessary contacts and get the necessary experience to actually decide to stay in the destination areas for at a more permanent basis. So what we also see is that from those West African countries that were studied, most migration, if driven by environmental factors, is a migration directed to neighboring countries. So, of course, there is a lot of people from West Africa who have been moving to, for example, Europe over the past 2 decades. But most of these migrations were not environmentally driven, and often the migrants who move to Europe actually come from more urban settings where drought is less of a factor in people's livelihoods. And one quite specific finding is that if you look at who migrates because of environmental change, several studies found that the people who were most likely to move for environmental reasons were men more than women, and farmers more than non-farmers, and also people with lower levels of education. So the idea is that people with higher levels of education usually have the kind of jobs that are less dependent on drought conditions. Another finding over those 15 different case studies is that, yes, there was a lot of migration, but it was usually not what we call disaster migration or displacement. So there was always an important level of voluntary, like a high level of choice, if you will, to migrate. Sometimes, of course, people are forced by the circumstances, you would say, to migrate, but this idea of big flows of people moving because of environmental disasters was not common in all of those case studies, and maybe in the situation might be different in East Africa, and I think Lisa is going to share her results about that later. What we also saw is that, and I'll show you an example of that in a bit, is that also that drought doesn't just drive migration, it can also limit migration. And I mentioned it earlier that when people don't have the resources or the means to migrate, it becomes more difficult to embark on those, especially those longer trips, like international migration. All right. I'm going to skip this one, and because I don't have so much time anymore, so I just wanted to say briefly a few words on this case study of Ghana, which was my PhD research some years back, and it was one of the studies that was also reviewed in this meta-analysis that I just talked about. So I looked at Ghana, movement from the north of Ghana to the middle belt, the Brong-Ahafo region. And if you look at the map on the right with the colors, you see that this is also a movement from the dry savanna to the forest savanna transition zone, and also a little bit the forest zone. So we see that on the map on the left with the arrows, we see that there are three big migration flows in Ghana. That's from the north to the south. It's to the capital Accra in the southeast, and then there's also a movement to the cocoa frontier in the southwest. So those are the three main flows. And for the study I did, we looked at the north-south migration, and I combined two different types of analysis or different types of methods. One was the local case studies, and then the other one was a more spatial analysis and a longitudinal analysis. And for the actual field work, I did questionnaires, focus group discussion, and life history. So it's a bit of a combination of survey data and more ethnographic work, and then also the more spatial geographic analysis. All right, so very, very quick this has to be. I can already say in advance that the findings from these three different methods show different results. So I think that's an important lesson, that if I would have focused only on one of those methods, my findings would have been different from when I combined these three levels of three different types of analysis. So what we see by talking to 200 migrants, we ask them simply about why did you migrate? And instead of making that predetermined categories, those were open questions. So we analyzed those open questions later and discovered patterns. So what we see, for example, is that a lot of the people who move from the north of Ghana to the south migrate because of scarcity of land. So the thing is that in Ghana, there are those pockets of really high population density in areas which are to the north in the savannah, while further down to the south, where conditions for agriculture are actually better, there are still big pieces of land which can be settled for farming. So a lot of the migrants that we talked to moved for that reasons, for land issues. And also in analyzing their answers, we saw that poverty, making money, was a main driver of migration. So at home, where they come from, when they farm, they can hardly feed their families. But in the south, where they migrated to, they can actually make quite good money with farming and selling their produce. What was not often mentioned was specifically climate change or drought, or even environmental degradation. So what we see is that they emphasize the fact that the conditions for farming were much better where they go to and much worse where they come from, without putting much emphasis on changes over time, whether the situation now is worse than it used to be. So even if the situation does not deteriorate in terms of environment, there can still be an environmental driver of migration if another place is just simply having better conditions, right? Environmental conditions. We also looked at different districts. So in northern Ghana at that time there were 24 districts. So for all those districts, we gathered data on migration, and we also gathered data on the environment. So climate, crop yields, but also vegetation, which you can't see that on the map here. So we did these spatial correlations between migration rates at district level and then different environmental variables at district level to see if there is a correlation. And you can see the scattergrams alongside the map. So you see this there's this negative correlation. So meaning that in areas with lower environmental quality, there's more outmigration, which actually sort of confirms the hypothesis that environmental conditions drive migration in northern Ghana. But then, when we look at the longitudinal analysis, there's the surprise. We see that in the 1970s and 80s, that was the time when environmental conditions were really bad in northern Ghana. This figure is actually quite similar to the one you saw for the Sahel as a whole. So in those years, you would expect, if environment does play an important role, and drought does play an important role in migration, you would expect migration from northern Ghana to increase in this period. But actually, the opposite was the case. So right in those years, between the 70s and 80s, migration rather reduced. So we did a literature analysis of what was the situation right then like in Ghana, and so in fact the whole country was in crisis, which maybe had to do also with the adverse climatic conditions, but there was really a political crisis where the people from the north who used to migrate to the south actually decided, many of them decided to return or to not go to the south because the political situation and the economic situation was also really bad in the south. So it was better to stay at home, where at least people could return to the land that their families owned and at least try to do some farming. Whereas if they would have been in the destination areas in the south, they would have had really a tough time finding any kind of income. The other hypothesis could be that because of poor harvest in that time, people wouldn't have the means to migrate to the south. But that's a bit of a conclusion I put a question mark with, because the distances and the cost of transport are such that you wouldn't need too much money to move to the south, and also people move as farm laborers usually to the south. So you wouldn't need much capital to get started in the south. So there's a bit of a doubt there. I'm going to skip this slide and just a few words still on the policy recommendations. So this is quite general, also for drought, environment, migration kind of relations. So what I think overall should always be the objective is to avoid forced migration. So avoid situations where people have no other option than to migrate, because when people have no other option than to migrate, usually the results, the effects of such movements are quite negative. Whereas voluntary migration can have a very positive effects, and policy should really aim at facilitating that those positive impacts of migration do materialize. I'm gonna skip those two next points, but the last one, I think it's important in the West African case that yes, there should be policy to combat desertification, land degradation, deforestation, etc. But it's really important to do that with respect for the interests of local farmers. Otherwise, the effects are going to be much more negative. All right, I'm going to leave it here. I look forward to Lisa's presentation and also questions from the students. And sorry if I took a bit longer than I planned to.
Thank you, Dr. Kees, so much for this very informative and also thought-provoking presentation and for sharing your research. And now I will hand over to Lisa from Oxford University. So Lisa, the microphone is yours.
So welcome everyone. I see that a lot of people from all over the world are connected, which is quite exciting. I'm doing my PhD on East African human mobility, so I keep it very broad, and climatic change. And I specifically explore the role of anthropogenic climate change, so the human causes in climatic change. And one of my case studies is Somalia. So let's get started. So the relationship between climate change and armed conflict is very complex. And some evidence points towards these changes in weather patterns lead to upticks in armed violence and conflict. And these changes usually result in localized violence rather than interstate warfare. And in this presentation, in particular, a country case study on Somalia, we will see in how far the dots on the ongoing drought conditions paired with conflict and displacement, so involuntary migration, can be connected. So disentangling the issue. Determining the role of climatic change independent of the causes of such change, for instance, human-induced climate change, and drought in times of armed conflict is rather complex. So there's an extensive academic literature exploring the connections between extreme weather events on the one hand, for instance, heat waves and natural disasters, for instance, floods and droughts, and armed violence and conflict on the other hand. A study published earlier this year by Gay Abel and colleagues from YASA find actually that most of the literature is organized along a triplet axis of one is climate change and migration, climate change and conflict, and third, conflict and migration itself. However, the literature does actually not point to a simple universal relationship between these three types of topics. And in East Africa, migration drivers in the context of conflict and climatic stress are actually not very well understood. So a little bit of background on Somalia itself. So anthropogenic climate change will hit the world's poorest first and hardest. That's what a lot of literature says, and also the IPCC climate report. Nowhere is that potentially truer than in Somalia, a scattered consortium of the Southern Federal Republic and two more or less semi-autonomous states, Somaliland and Puntland, geographically located in the Horn of Africa. So we're going from case study more to the east of Africa. And Somalia has endured cycles of drought, disrupting actually really well-established migration paths, which have traditionally been used in order to cope with extreme weather events. They've been mainly used by pastoralists and their livestock in the past years. However, political instability and conflict over the past 2 decades, paired with prolonged drought conditions, have struck much of the Horn of Africa. And they actually also jeopardize the humanitarian and social situation, along with economic and political stability itself. And in mid-2017, so about 1.5 years ago, more than half of the Somali population was in need of humanitarian assistance according to UN numbers. You see here this big number, over 6 million people, which is quite a lot. So the motivation for this case study is that in the context of Somalia, factors which are of particular concern, despite drought and political instability, are also insecurity in the context of the militant group Al-Shabaab. And they are particularly present in the central and southern parts of Somalia. There's also a limited presence and capacities of government institutions, and this doesn't make the situation overall much easier. There's limited access by humanitarian and development actors to actually reach the population in need, limited livelihood opportunities, and a lack of basic services as well, such as health and education opportunities, poor infrastructure, and overall, unfortunately, low levels of early recovery and development. And here in this figure, the arrow is working out. You see, you see security incidences including Al-Shabaab, and on the right hand, excluding Al-Shabaab. So on the one hand, we look at the militant group and security incidences, and on the other hand, we look at how do security incidences, conflict events shape when there's no presence of Al-Shabaab at all. And what's really interesting is that you actually see a trend, a slight increase in numbers over time when there are conflict events which include Al-Shabaab conflict actors. And on the other hand, on the right-hand side, you see that the security incidences have a slight decrease over the course of 2012 to 2017. So what's really interesting on a global scale is that a global debate has emerged whether the human impact of climate change can lead to actually to armed conflict, and how conflict and extreme weather events interact and potentially actually induce large-scale displacement, so involuntary migration. And despite widely cited, there are also academics who question this theory by a person called Homer Dixon, that climate change and environmental scarcity actually lead to conflict, so more conflict due to environmental scarcity and fight over resources. So scarcity can favor collaboration between groups that otherwise compete over the same natural resources. An example of this is the country case study by Adam and colleagues from 2012 on Kenya, so in the East African region. So the question now is, can we actually blame climate change for Somalia's humanitarian crisis? And I thought here it's really interesting to have a qualitative overview on agricultural factors such as the crop production index and livestock production index, which you see in, this is the crop production index in dark gray, and in light gray is the livestock production index. And what we did here is we looked at the events over time from 1980 to about 2016-17 in order to see in how far extreme weather events and conflict events have actually an impact on agricultural output. And there are actually, just like time, I would like to focus on 2 events over time in particular, and which we can learn from. One is agriculture, which presents the backbone of the country, is more or less stable over time, despite these huge shocks which the country experiences. And what's really interesting is when you look at the overthrow of the Bar government in 1991, and bear in mind there was the outbreak of the Civil War in 1989 to 1991, you actually see that these political instabilities have a huge effect on both livestock production as well as the crop production. But when you look at, for instance, the El Nino event, which was only a year later, you see that agriculture as a sector actually is not, hit that bad and recovers quite quickly. So this is the other point you can really learn from this graph, is that despite all these shocks, recoveries quite quickly, and maybe extreme weather events are not the sole cause of economic disruptions. And the other really interesting point I wanted to make is during the time of the East African drought in 2011 and 12, we can actually learn another really interesting thing, is that because the whole of the East African region was affected, we see an effect on agriculture here in Somalia. You look at this graph here on the crop production index, which has kind of decrease, sharp decrease in 2011 and 12. And so kind of from the country case study on Somalia, we can learn that migration stories have also a climate conflict chapter. And this big graph over here shows you a network analysis of regional displacement over the course of 2016 to 2018. And the data we got from UNHCR, and UNHCR goes into the country and interviews internally displaced people according to their number one reason why they claim they have been displaced. And they categorize these reasons in four kind of factors. One is drought-related displacement, flood-related displacement, conflict-related displacement, and they have another group which is kind of summarized as other, where forced eviction, for instance, took place. And from this graph, we can really see that along the timeline of the past 2 years, all 18 regions of Somalia have been affected by displacement, and displacement due to these four main reasons. So we still don't really know whether climate plays a role in displacement, or if it's conflict which actually takes the lead in why people claim to be. So again, with the same type of data, we plotted this in a map, and I hope this is working when I click on it. Oh, it's not, unfortunately. Well, over the course of 2016 and 18, you can see with this bubbles here, that the number of internally displaced people in destination areas across Somalia varies due to the number one reason they claim to have been displaced. So as we still did not get the answer we were kind of looking for, we investigated climate data, really climate data, and tried to make sense of what's going on. And at the moment, actually since 2015, Somalia has been experiencing a lot of drought conditions, which we see here. Here's Somalia. So this is Somalia, and we can see here that this is a map of precipitation anomalies during the onset of the recent drought. And this is averaged over 4 months. And what's really interesting is that the dark red areas here in the center of Somalia, along the coastlines of Somalia, you really see that there has been less than normal precipitation, and actually by almost 80%, which is the dark red, and by about 40 to 60%, which is the kind of bright red, across the country. And only in a few areas of the country you actually see more precipitation. So these kind of extremes in climate and in weather are something which is really persistent, unfortunately, in Somalia. So it's challenging for people to to address that. And the same thing we did for the same time frame in 2017 also, in order to see the difference. And here you can see clearly that the lack of rainfall is not as, first of all, not as bad anymore, and only the north of the country compared to actually the south and the center of the country are affected. So this is another really interesting point we wanted to make. Yes, is there signal and displacement? That was our initial question. And the findings from our case study I would like to talk. So in Somalia, displacement is multi-causal, and that kind of reflects the case study on West African countries, and it cannot be seen without the historical and economic interlinks. And we also demonstrate this multi-causality through analyzing three types of data sets. One is the UNHCR displacement data. We also looked at conflict data at the beginning from oxide, as well as temperature and precipitation anomalies. And what's really interesting is that we find these lack dynamics of drought-related displacement, and they sometimes turn into conflict-related displacement. However, one cannot see any general or make any general comments on that. And at the same time, we have only 2 years of data, so this relates to the third point in my presentation here. We also find that armed conflict in Somalia is dynamic and complex, shaped by vested interests of actors and also independent factors very often. So climate is not necessarily the prime and main and only reason why people get displaced. And conflict appears less of a driver of large-scale displacement, rather representing a constant feature in displacement dynamics across Somalia. We've seen that in the qualitative timeline overview from 1980 to 2016, that there are so many different factors which come into play. And again, the data availability, only 2 years of data does not really allow us to make any general points. So please see this time and country. Yeah, and these are my references. If you're interested in further exploring this topic, Africa, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for your presentation and for keeping it short because now we have a very short time for the questions and answers. So I already can see a couple of questions in the chat, and I would also ask our participants if you have a question and you would like to share it by talking. So please raise your hand. So in the upper toolbar, you can see this sign for raising hand. So if you raise your hand, I will give you the microphone. Otherwise, we will go through the text chat questions. Okay. Yeah, I mean the slide is empty, but okay. Now I can see the question. Okay, so I think this question is directed to Lisa, I would say. Yeah. And Lisa, because we have some concerns here about your voice, so can you please raise your voice?
I'll try that. Maybe it's my microphone. I'm sorry about that. Okay, I increased my volume as well. All right. So shall I just go ahead and answer the question?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I think this relates to the timeline graph I gave. So the crop production index, that's data from the World Bank, and let's see. So this is the output, the crop production, like the output which has been produced. That's my understanding of the data, which is an annual index, and it gets adjusted over time. And this kind of shows that my point was that even though you have large droughts, they don't affect agriculture that much, and there are other factors coming into play why this is the case. And
Okay, thank you. And I think we have like one question from Diana, so I will give the microphone for you, Diana, so you can talk.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Kees.
Yeah. Okay. I'm reading Diana's question in the chat. What did happen with the women in Ghana while men have to migrate? How do they survive? Good question. Thank you, Diana. So I like the question because it allows me to say something about like also the different methods. If you would only do these kind of analysis with census data and environmental data, you wouldn't really learn much about what drought and what migration actually means to people on the ground, right? So by combining this kind of analysis with survey work and more ethnographic work, where we have these longer open interviews with people, we can get information on the kind of questions that you also asked. So what we see in Ghana, two things on gender. In the past, more men than women migrated, and since 2010, for the first time in recorded history, there are now more women than men migrating in Ghana between regions from at the time of the 2010 census. So that's one thing. But for this particular migration of farmers and farm laborers, there's still indeed much more men migrating. And what happens to the women who stay behind? So for the seasonal migration, that's when men migrate from northern Ghana to southern Ghana in the dry season. So when it's dry season in the north and there's less work on the farms, they work for 6 months in the farms in the south. And so during those 6 months, there's not much agricultural work to be done at home. So in that sense, the men aren't missed that much for work purposes, maybe for other reasons, yes. But the idea is also that these men migrate with the aim of coming back with savings. So the idea is that the money they can make in the south contributes to the well-being of the household in the rest of the year. So and now also with improved technologies, they can already send money home through their mobile phones, which would help the family to make it through the dry season. So this is maybe a bit of a positive version of the story, but I think that's the main thing. There could be other issues which also came out through the interviews, where some female respondents complained that during the time that their men are away, there's much more workload for them, and sometimes they also complain that their men waste their money on alcohol when they are during their migration. So maybe I should go to the next question.
I actually have a question on the next question. David, do you mean our current political climate? Is that geographically meant as Europe or worldwide? Would you like to go ahead? Shall I?
You go, Lisa.
So I think in the context of Africa, or the region where I look into, I think a lot can be done, either climate resilient jobs, so to say, so facilitating migration to urban centers, but away from the agricultural business to having other types of jobs. So facilitating education, investing in education, essentially. I think that's something I can see for the East African region.
Yeah, thanks. I'll move to the next question because I was well, Lisa, while you were answering, I was reading the other question. So the question is, migration reduced in the period of worst environmental stress. What would be the scenario if the environmental stress would be related to agriculture or alternative job? So what happened in northern Ghana in the 70s and 80s was that, yes, there was this big environmental problems around the multi-year drought, which reduced the crop yields in that time. So there was hunger, there was very little agricultural production, and the problem was actually that all these problems came together at the same time, because alternative jobs were also not there because of the political and economic crisis. So people were really sort of squeezed with very little options. So in an earlier study I did there, which was not specifically about migration, we actually found out that many of the coping strategies that people used in the 70s and 80s were things like eating wild foods that they had, their ancestors used to eat, like food that they would find in the wild, like certain roots and leaves, which they had abandoned those practices. But in those crises of the 70s and 80s, when they had so little other options, that would be one of the important coping strategies, as an example, because there were no alternative jobs. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
the next one, due to La Nina and El Nino. It could be that it's a typo, I'm sorry.
Okay. I think there is a lot of questions coming up there, but I would give the microphone to David and Diana because they already raised their hands. Maybe they would like to follow up with their questions. So David, I think you can speak now. So if you have a follow-up question on your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can. Okay, I'm very sorry. My raising my hand was towards my previous question. So I feel that right now is maybe a bit late to pose it, but it was just basically, I mean, there's a lot of xenophobia in various regions, not just in Europe, unfortunately, but I've been working a lot in Southern Africa, and they have to deal with a lot of xenophobia. So you come from this sort of political forum where migration is seen as something to be avoided, but then you go to a climate forum where migration is seen as a perfectly justifiable adaptation response. So I sometimes I struggle in I guess kind of reconciling these two very contradictory pictures in my head.
Yeah, just a quick reaction from my side. I think, even we ourselves as researchers are sort of responsible for this, because on the one hand, we think that it's important to study this topic, the possible links between climate change and migration, and so when we write research proposals, and when we write for popular sources, we want to emphasize it is important to look at this. But at least my experience is that when I actually go out to the field and study it in detail, then often that side of migration, where migration is actually also seen often by people as a very legitimate and effective strategy to adapt to changes and to cope with certain tough situations. So it is the picture that I usually get from the field is much more positive than the more sort of alarmistic or dramatic picture that we sometimes also see if you just think like, okay, the sea levels are going to rise with 1 meter in the next century. So there are all those places and those millions of people living in places where the elevation is less than 1 meter. So you think that this is drama, but then actually when you go into the field and research it, you find out that there is actually quite a lot of ability by people to adapt, and ability by organizations to adapt. And sometimes that comes with huge losses and costs. But often the experience from going to those areas is a bit more positive than what you would expect from the outset.
Maybe I can add to that a bit on the literature. So I don't have a lot of field experience compared to West Africa, but I see that a lot of the research on East Africa is either social science heavy or natural science heavy, but there is not a lot of interdisciplinary work which really looks into methodologies from both social science and understands that, while incorporating, for instance, climate data to a level like, for instance, natural scientists working together with social scientists. I don't think this is something which happens very, very often on the migration issue, at least in East Africa, on my focus region. And I hope that will, in the future, be a bit more often done. And I would personally look forward to that.
Thank you, David, Kees, and Lisa. And now, Diana, if you would like to share your question, the microphone is yours now. Diana, can you hear me? Okay, so I think we have 3 questions. So 2 questions for Lisa and 1 for Kees.
Hi.
Hi, Diana, I can hear you. So if you still have a question, this is your opportunity to share it now.
Yes, do you hear me? Oh, okay. Now, I just want to ask, the last question is to Kees. Do you consider this particular ethnic Ga people on your research, or no, you just focus on farmers in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the people I worked with for this research were Dagara people from northwest Ghana, and they're in Accra, right, in the capital. So that would be one of the destination areas of migrants. But I did not specifically look at Ga people, no.
Okay, so I would suggest to go quickly through the last 2 questions for Lisa, I would say.
Right, so the first one is on direct causes between climatic change and environmental degradation, and I guess more or less conflict and the political situation in Somalia. For Somalia, I don't think there are necessarily causal linkages directly. I think it's important to quantify the different drivers. So for instance, climatic change versus political drivers of migration in general, but I don't think there are any causal linkages. I think it is very multi-causal. And the next question is, oh wow. So food security in the future. It very much depends, I would say. With rapidly growing populations, for instance, in Ethiopia, I think you can also see that people are moving away from the agricultural business, but at the same time, I would assume that there are more food imports from other countries. So due to you would probably see more financial investments in that. However, I do think when you have more climatic extremes, such as heat waves and floods hitting particular countries, we definitely need climate adaptation measures in order to be prepared for these impacts of climate change in the future.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And I can see one last question from Julian about the possibility of sharing the presentations of today's webinar. So Julian and everyone, this webinar has been recorded and we will share the link to everyone here. And also because I see that the discussion is really interesting. So immediately after the end of this webinar, we will send you an email by the end of today with a link. And this link has the virtual learning environment of the GlobeDrought. So you can continue also sharing your questions for both presentations, and we will share these questions with Kees and Lisa within the next 3 weeks. Yeah, this is the link for our e-learning platform. So you can, in this link, you have only to sign in, and you will find the recorded webinar with the presentations, with the all this discussion that we have today. And also we have the opportunity to share your questions, your experiences, whatever you would like to share in the forum discussion. And if you have a particular question, we will going to share it with our presenters within the next 3 weeks. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kees, and thank you so much, Lisa, for your time and for this very informative presentations. And by mentioning, because it has been mentioned in Kees' presentation, women and drought in Ghana, and there was also a question about it. So I would like to remind you that next month our main topic in the webinar will be about gender and drought. Thank you so much, and this is not the end. So we will continue with this discussion on the e-learning virtual place of the GlobeDrought. Thank you for everyone who have been there in the webinar, and again thank you to our presenters, and looking forward to another interesting webinar. Thank you and goodbye.